Khartoum, Sudan, a metropolis of over 5 million people, has been engulfed in fierce fighting for 2 weeks now. The city sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert and at the intersection of the White and Blue Nile rivers. It is an ancient location and has been the seat of governance for a large part of Africa for over 100 years. Now the city is filled with death and destruction and a deteriorating situation that has forced many countries from around the world to send in their special forces in order to evacuate their embassy staff. Among the countries is the United States, who had a diplomatic convoy fired upon in the city on the 17th of April. Currently, the airport in Khartoum is unusable, and foreign nationals are forced to make the trek 400 miles northeast to Port Sudan, where they can find passage to return home. All of this in today's Frontline Report. Welcome to New World Econ War Reports for the 30th of April 2023 Frontline Update, this time for the civil war in Sudan. Before we get started, please consider hitting both that like and subscribe button, actions that are totally free for you but are a big help for me to grow the channel. Also, remember you can hit that bell icon so you do not miss the next update. All right, guys. So this one, unlike how I've been doing usually, I actually do not have a script. The situation is far too complicated, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive in to the slideshow I have put together for you guys. Those of you that do not know, Sudan is a country, and we'll go ahead and actually zoom this back out so you can see where Sudan is on the map. It is along the Nile River, and it is south of Egypt. So when you find Africa, find Egypt, find the Nile River, and keep going technically upstream, but south along the Nile River until you reach the country of Sudan. It is a very large country. It used to be larger. Sudan used to encompass this entire area of South Sudan as well. South Sudan is actually the most recent UN recognized nation, so it's like the newest country in the world, I guess you can say. It is one actually hilariously is one of Obama's great achievements that they used to talk about when he was in office, that he brokered the deal to end the Sudanese civil war, which separated North and South Sudan and pitted them on different sides. Since that deal has been made and South Sudan has been turned into a new country, it itself is also engulfed in civil war. Now, to talk about Sudan and the current conflict, there are two different sides. One side is the RSF, which stands for Rapid Support Forces. These guys are essentially Arab tribesmen. They were put together by the former president or ruler of Sudan, which I have his name here, and his name Omar al-Bashir. So Omar al-Bashir was the former president, and he founded this group and was using this militia to fight a civil war in this region you're looking at right here. You'll see this green area that's boxed out. That's still an area where there are rebel forces that are currently fighting both the government and the RSF in the area. They used to control a lot more territory. This is called the Darfur region, and there was a very nasty, terrible war there where the president, Omar al-Bashir, apologies, he was actually charged by the International Criminal Court that's based in Europe on charges of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. A lot of this stuff would have actually been carried out by the RSF forces on the ground here. So in the years after that war and the peace, our guy al-Bashir, I keep forgetting his name, I'm sorry. There's a couple of these names that I'm trying to remember in my head, but he starts to give the RSF more and more power and more status as actual real military and less of a militia. And according to Wikipedia, this what he's doing was essentially trying to coup-proof himself, and basically by giving equal power to two separate militaries, it prevents one from launching a coup against him and overthrowing him. Well, surprise, surprise, they actually teamed up together and overthrew him and imprisoned him, probably in Khartoum. So since that happened, the de facto ruler of Sudan has been a guy named Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and he is the general that leads the Sudanese army. And the general that leads the RSF, a guy that was hired actually by al-Bashir, is a guy named Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, and this is the guy that leads the RSF and essentially ran the war against the Darfur tribes and stuff. So, what's going on now? If you're wondering if there is particularly like a side that you should take here, if like there's good guys, bad guys. According to the people, the vast majority of Sudan, the Sudanese people want a democracy, and both sides are essentially fighting over who gets to be the military dictator at this point. So, while arguably the RSF is probably worse because they've recently been fighting a war where they've devastated a local population. There's millions of people that have been displaced from the Darfur region, and hundreds of thousands that have been killed. The Sudanese population wants neither side to be in charge of them. They have been fighting for the last couple years and protesting for these dictators, whether it's al-Bashir or Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. They've been protesting against all of them, trying to get them to hold elections, and the military and the government won't do it. So, just putting that out there at the very beginning, this is not the kind of situation where, I obviously am not going to take sides in this situation. I think if either side wins, it's going to end up bad for the population. Arguably, perhaps worse if the RSF takes power, because worse for the tribes people in the Darfur region and some of these other regions of southern Sudan. So, carrying on to look at the areas that each side controls, as you can see here, the RSF controls the regions that they typically have been operating in over the past couple years, along with some highways that lead up to Khartoum. So this is through the desert here that we're looking at, where the RSF controls kind of a route into town. This is to connect, the main army with the forces they have fighting inside the capital. In terms of the Sudanese army, they control the southern parts of the country where they are also fighting against rebels. I just don't have them marked on the map quite yet, but a lot of these southern regions close to South Sudan and Ethiopia, there is a lot of rebel activities, but the seat, or kind of the concentration of the Sudanese army power right now, is in areas like Port Sudan, along the Nile River to the north, and then in the south, in these areas where they're fighting against rebels, as well as on the border areas of Ethiopia. So, in my opinion, just looking at the situation, it seems like the Sudanese army is really spread out, giving a big advantage right now to the RSF, who isn't operating with aircraft. But it's not like the Sudanese army is operating with a large enough air force probably to force the RSF back. They do have fighter jets, and there's been airstrikes in Khartoum over the last couple of weeks, but I highly doubt it's anything to the level that's gonna turn the battle. So going ahead to we're gonna go ahead and zoom in and look at Khartoum. A bad situation for the Sudanese army in the south. The RSF has captured on both sides of the Blue Nile villages that sit on the roadways that connect southern Sudan. Some of these areas, like the Sudanese army that's fighting the rebels in the south, or the Sudanese army that's holding the border with Ethiopia, two areas where I expect Sudanese troops are probably massed. For one, obviously, if you're fighting rebels, you're going to have a lot of troops around. In terms of Ethiopia, Sudan and Ethiopia have, I guess you could say, a fragile relationship. A lot of these countries do right now, so there's actually some border tension there. By occupying these areas, the RSF has kind of cut off any reinforcements from those two directions. Now, moving in to look directly to the east of the capital here, um, the RSF also operates or controls highways that connect to border regions of Eritrea and Ethiopia. And by the way, I'm sorry I forgot to mention it here. The RSF is in the yellow color. The Sudanese army is in red, and the orange areas are contested zones. That's where both sides are fighting. So the yellow areas are firmly in control by the RSF. The red areas are firmly in control by the Sudanese army, and the orange areas are contested. And this map here, the overall map was based off of a Wikipedia map. It was really the only thing I could find on who controls what parts of the country. Zooming in on the area of Khartoum here, as you can see, there's a lot of blank areas, a lot of areas that aren't really marked up or anything. This map is based on War Mapper's map from Twitter. He was really the only person I've found that has a good map and a good descriptive map that shows the situation where troops have been spotted from each side in these zones of control. So shout out to him. Good job for laying a lot of this out. This map roughly follows his in terms of inspiration, but it's not exact. So just keep that in mind. In terms of on the western bank of the White Nile and the Nile River here, or I'm sorry, the eastern bank, or no, I'm sorry, I was right. The western bank of the river here. It's important to note the bridges. The bridges are very important in this situation. As you can see, a lot of the city, a lot more of the city is under the control of the RSF, but the Sudanese army has done very well to block access for most of these connections here. As you can see, to the northern area here, this northern bridge, while the RSF controls one side of it, the Sudanese army controls the other, preventing these two large pockets from connecting. And then down here further to the south, there are two bridges that are under the control, essentially, or being blocked, and are blocking the RSF from linking up in these two areas. So the Sudanese army is playing the situation very smart. It does appear, though, that they are outnumbered or outgunned inside of Khartoum. Further to the north, the Sudanese army is making gains over the last couple weeks since the war started and have captured large areas to the north of Khartoum, as well as a bridge, making sure that in the far north parts of town, they actually have access to both sides of the river. But unfortunately, further up, the RSF also has roadblocks set up along on the eastern side of the Nile River. So in the center, this is one of like the big important areas of town that we're going to talk about. Obviously, you see contested zones. Those are areas where the Sudanese army is preventing the RSF from linking up. Keep in mind, this is a very, very large city, and in terms of the size of each army, for the RSF, you're looking at anywhere from probably 80 to 150,000 troops. For the Sudanese army, it's very similar, like 120,000 is what a lot of online sources are saying. Before this conflict picked up, the RSF was kicking in some really hard mobilization and recruitment efforts. I would assume the Sudanese army has done so as well over the last couple days. So both armies are probably much, much larger than they were, but it's still not enough men to control extremely large areas of town, right? Like you have to have troops patrolling in the rear. You also have your guys on the front line. it's difficult for both sides in terms of manpower. That's why you're seeing a situation like this where each side controls tiny little sections of town. They're just trying to, move around, be strategic, capture key locations, and hold off until reinforcements arrive. Essentially, which is taking some time. This has been 2 weeks for the situation to even develop to get to this point. So. Um, just noting once again here, if you look towards the bottom of the screen, the bridges, you have 3 bridges that connect the eastern bank of the Nile with the center of the city that's in between the blue and the white. So once again, the Sudanese army controls areas around all 3 bridges, blocking access for the RSF, but the RSF are probably pushing in these areas, trying to gain access to these bridges. I think this goes a little deeper into town, just to give you guys an idea of the situation here. This is the international zone. It's very close to the airport. This is also where the government of Sudan sits. So a lot of ministries are in this area, and a lot of embassies. And if you want to get an idea of how many foreigners are in the country, just for example, this has been in the news lately. The U.S. has about 15,000 foreign nationals or people with dual citizenship in Sudan that they're looking to evacuate. Egypt has about 10,000. And of course, you have most of the countries in the world actually having embassies inside of Khartoum. Of course, you can see here Embassy of Turkey, Embassy of the Arab Republic of Egypt, Embassy of Saudi Arabia is in here somewhere. Sometimes you got to zoom in a little further to get some of these stuff. You have like the South Korean embassy, the Canadian embassy, the British embassy is in this area somewhere. And then there was a lot of fighting in this area around the main government quarters. So this office right here, it did say the General Command of the Sudanese Armed Forces. This building has changed hands several times, allegedly, as well as several of these other big buildings in this central area here, these big government offices. So right now it's a fight for who controls these areas. In terms of the Khartoum International Airport, we've had reports of it changing hands potentially a couple different times. It appears as of now the RSF is in control of the Khartoum International Airport. There was a story about a Turkish military plane that was trying to evacuate Turkish citizens from the airport, and that plane was fired upon. I'm not sure exactly what the outcome of that is, but I believe that it was fired upon while it was on the airstrip. It hadn't actually taken off yet, and the passengers were evacuated off the plane and out of harm's way. So one of the big reasons why this situation is very important and deserves a lot more coverage is there's embassy staff of hundreds of nations that are living in this zone, that are hunkered down inside of these embassies while there's literally a war going on outside in the streets between two dueling um, between two dueling authoritarian military factions, essentially. So it's a very rough situation. It's already kind of a rough part of the world, and this makes things a lot worse. So in terms of trying to evacuate people, so far the stories I've heard are that the U.S. is been one of the more successful ones. The main reason is the U.S. embassy is actually pretty far to the south of town. It is right here, so I mean, kind of giving you a view of where all the fighting is going on here. You have most of the city of Khartoum to the north is pretty messed up right now at this point, and then the U.S. embassy is down here to the south. So the U.S. has been able to evacuate some embassy staff. That has been reported actually in the last 2 days that we've started getting our citizens out. And the way that that's going is probably somewhat by car. you can escape through the southern parts of town across some of these bridges down here, and then you got to get somewhat north and then drive to Port Sudan. So Port Sudan, for those of you guys that can't see it on the screen, is right over here. And we'll go ahead and get rid of this circle here. But Port Sudan's over here. There's an airport there. Of course, it's a seaport. It's actually a pretty big seaport. So a lot of foreigners are trying to get out of town or get out of the country through that way. And for the Americans, they're likely, in terms of the Sudanese army, they're likely giving the Americans access to the airspace. That way they can just helicopter our people out from the embassy there. But all right, guys, that is the update for the Civil War. I will give another update when the situation changes, when one side or the other captures more ground inside of town. This took a lot of work, obviously, trying to map all of this out. Of course, remember, War Mapper did the hardest part, trying to determine where these things were in the first place. A lot of this, I copied off of him. So good job to War Mapper. Thanks for putting out good information. Thanks you guys for watching, and until next time.